Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Today, it's the second episode in our series about the history of thinking about thinking machines. And I'm talking to Shannon about a short story from 1955 that maybe predicted, or maybe parodied, the future of democracy. Isaac Asimov's Franchise. We're talking about a short story today by Isaac Asimov, in many ways the king, I think, of the robot story. This one's called Franchise. It was published in 1955. Let me give a very, very condensed summary of what it's about before we try and decide what we think it means. So it's the story of a man called Norman Muller, who lives in Bloomington, Indiana, mid-sized town, middle America, very, very average guy. It's set in the future, in 2008, as it happens, the 2008 presidential election, at a time when it's imagined a super smart, super powerful computer, this vast machine called multivac. And from the 1950s, this is imagining powerful machines as very big, has the capacity to extrapolate from a very small amount of data the result of the election. In this case, multivac only needs one voter, and it picks what it takes to be a typical voter. That's why Norman is a very average guy in a very average place. And multivac then asks Norman Muller a series of questions, like an intensive focus group. And off the back of that, multivac decides the result of the election. Not just the presidential election, all the elections. It has all the data it needs, just needs one sample voter, and that's democracy. I'm just going to read the last line of the story. The very last line is this. In this imperfect world, the sovereign citizens of the first and greatest electronic democracy had, through Norman Muller, through him, exercised once again its free, untrammeled franchise. Do you think there's anything else that people need to know about the story up front before we get into it?
No, I think that covers the essentials.
So one of the things that I think is so interesting about this story, and lots of it is interesting, is it runs together two different ways of imagining from 1955 a future in which machine technology, smart technology might decide or interpose itself into democratic politics. One of those is by its extraordinary predictive power. That is, it doesn't need much evidence of what human beings are doing to know what all human beings would do in a given set of circumstances. And then the other, which is very different, is interpretive power, because it does two things. It picks Norman Muller, and then it also works out what he's thinking. So what's interesting is it doesn't say to Norman Muller, you've been identified as the one sample voter. Who do you want to win the election? It doesn't ask him who he's voting for. He doesn't actually get a vote. He has to answer a series of questions, about, like a focus group, about his preferences and what he's thinking about, I don't know, grain prices or whatever it is. And then multivac decides who's going to be the president. So these are two very different things. Let's start with the first, because this is clearly a feature of contemporary politics, even back then, the predictive power of technology to work out the outcome of an election from small amounts of data. Now, in 1955, it was presumably assumed that computers would get better and better and better at this pretty quickly. I'm not sure they have got that much better. I don't know what you think, Shannon, but here we are, well beyond 2008. They're still not great at predicting the outcome of elections.
Well, what's funny is that there's still a lot of humans that are basically driving those predictions, right? It is the sort of Nate Silvers of the world and the pundits who look at the polling data and interpret it and, kind of read the tea leaves and routinely get it wrong. But also the polling data itself is often based on older methodologies that may or may not reflect what a machine learning model of voters' preferences might look like. So I'm extremely skeptical about the performance of machine prediction for lots of reasons. But one of the things that's really interesting is that the way that we use political data today and the kinds of predictions that we generate from it are really mixed in with kind of human biases and human methodologies and assumptions that explain probably why the predictions are often quite wrong. But at the same time, I found the story really interesting in that it's anticipating machine learning on the basis of training data that tracks correlations as opposed to reasons. So, one of the really interesting features of it, as you mentioned, is that it's checking what Asimov calls the imponderable attitudes and very much the emotions of voters like Norman Mueller. When they explain to him what it's doing, they tell him that actually it's looking very closely at his emotional responses and his galvanic skin response and his heart rate. And it's not just about the words, it's also about how his body responds to certain ideas. And from this, it's supposed to be able to, I think, model the current state of the American political consciousness. And that is exactly the kind of fever dream that a lot of ambitious machine learning researchers are pursuing right now. And it's based on this idea that somehow, if you have enough data, these magical correlations will fall out that will just tell you everything without you having to know how the answer was arrived at. And so, this idea of opacity of algorithms, that we get the right answers, but by some kind of alchemy that even the software developers don't understand and the machine learning researchers don't really understand. They understand the mechanisms, but they don't understand how, from this pool of data, this answer is arrived at. And that's true for all large machine learning models today. And it appears to be true in the story about Multivac.
And Multivac is a machine. He's very nervous about being the voter for reasons that we'll come on to. But he's quite excited about meeting Multivac. It's this mythical creature, really. But he doesn't meet Multivac. Multivac's questions have to be filtered through a human being. So he sits in a room with a representative of Multivac and the American government who feeds the questions. And when he tries, as you say, to get explanations as to what's going on, he's told that, A, it's not your business, but also it's not really our business. The machine does what the machine does, and we are just here to feed you the questions and feed your answers back in. We're told that the machine has this vast data set. So the machine kind of knows most things about American preferences, not voters' preferences because they aren't voters, but American citizen preferences. But it needs this extra human element. It needs one representative voter to be probed and prodded and see how he responds to different kinds of provocations in order to extrapolate the full result. It's both futuristic in its way, but it's based on something that was happening at the time. So the name Multivac comes from a computer called Univac that had been launched in the 1952 presidential election. So we're in 55. The 52 presidential election, which was between Eisenhower and Stevenson. And it happens to be the first election where the CBS newscast was hosted by Walter Cronkite, who was going to become America's newsman. And CBS, with great fanfare, launched this gimmick, I guess it was, to go with the election, which is they had this machine which, on the basis of some of the results, was going to predict the final result. But this was pretty crude stuff. I mean, it's the kind of thing that we're completely used to now. We know that on the basis of some of the results, you can come quite close to predicting the final result, unless it's a very, very, very close election. But this was heralded as a kind of massive breakthrough in information science, that a machine was going to tell people how votes were going to cash out before they'd even be counted. And it was almost treated as a harbinger of the future. And yet it's very crude relative to what even is being talked about in this story. So you have 20% of the results in, and on that basis, you can say, as the machine did, Eisenhower's going to win. Well, most human beings could probably do that too. It's not that complicated. And yet this story is an extrapolation from that, as though it's somehow on a logical sequence, that from 20% of the actual voting results, you can get an election which is called on the basis of one person who doesn't even vote. That's quite an extrapolation.
It is. And it's curious, too, because right now we're having a conversation in the AI world about whether the future advancements in AI will be driven by getting ever larger models built on ever larger oceans of data, which is, of course, incredibly costly, both from an economic and an environmental standpoint, but also requires, extractive practices of data collection and scraping that are invasive and present their own problems. or whether the future is about building kind of smaller and smaller models that use algorithms to extract somehow more relevant information from smaller but higher quality pools of data. And it's really interesting, as I was reading this, they talk about how multivac sort of started out with these computers that could only, in fact, predict the vote on the basis of these massive amounts of voter data. And then as the algorithms improved, they say multivac, gets to the point where it actually only needs this one data point, which is the mind of Norman Mueller. And I thought that was just a really interesting kind of prescience of the debate that we're having today about whether big data is the future or small targeted data is the future. And of course, they each present their own political and moral problems.
And then still, when I finished it, I still couldn't decide whether this story was saying that this machine predicted what Norman Mueller's vote would mean for the overall result of the election, or this machine decided what Norman Mueller thought. And I still think they're two very different things. And I think Asimov runs them together, either deliberately or not. I'm not completely sure. If multivac is an extension of univac, well, univac was simply a predictive model of the kind that are used in elections day. The recent British general election, there's now quite a sophisticated exit poll model that they use. It's very good at giving you the overall picture. It's actually still quite weak at the details. So in the recent UK general election, it gave the overall shape of the result very clearly, but it was way off actually on the reform vote total. It was bad at a micro level. And that's where we're at, but that's state of the art. But it's predictive on the basis of what information it has. It predicts what has happened, but isn't yet known, which is very different from saying to Norman, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? And on the basis of how not just his mouth answers, but his body responds, saying, this is what you really think. This is who you actually want to be president. Is it predictive or is it interpretive or is it a jumble of the two?
I think it's ambiguous, and I agree with you that I don't think we can tell from the story whether it's deliberately ambiguous or not. But there's a passage I want to read from the book because I think it's really indicative of what Asimov does think in the story that Multivac is doing. So this is during the kind of first explanation that Norman gets from Multivac's handler, who is also called Handley, which I don't think is an accident, because actually there's another Asimov story, because of course Multivac appears in many of Asimov's stories, and there's another story in which this line has always stuck with me, that Asimov describes the human handlers of Multivac dealing with it as lightly as they could. To get to your earlier point, that they're sort of shepherding this machine that even they themselves don't fully understand. But so Handley, the handler of Multivac and also of Norman, is telling Norman about how this works. And he says, Multivac weighs all sorts of known factors, billions of them. One factor isn't known, though, and won't be known for a long time. That's the reaction pattern of the human mind. All Americans are subjected to the molding pressure of what other Americans do and say, to the things that are done to him and the things he does to others. Any American can be brought to Multivac to have the bent of his mind surveyed. From that, the bent of all other minds in the country can be estimated. Some Americans are better for the purpose than others at some given time. What I think is amazing about that paragraph, this idea of the molding pressure, and when he speaks of the bent of his mind, I think there's a beautiful ambiguity that is intended in that phrase, right? So we talk about, the bent of your mind, meaning the general direction or kind of shape of your thinking. So it means that ordinary sense of the bent of your mind. But the previous sentence has also been talking about how American minds bend in response to the pressures from other minds. So this idea of political influence is coming in here. And this idea that Norman may have been chosen precisely because his political mind exemplifies that malleability, that tendency to bend to the pressure of bigger patterns of American thinking. It's because Norman is not an independent political thinker that he is chosen. That's the implication, I think, here. When Handley says some Americans are better for the purpose, I think he means some Americans are more receptive to these kinds of pressures. Their minds are more readily bent. And I think he's essentially telling Norman that this year, his is the mind that most perfectly takes on the shape of other minds. So I think this idea of groupthink, this idea of being subject to various kinds of political pressures and influences that are not, in fact, driven by reasons, is really part of the story here. As you started us off pointing out, one of the most fascinating things about the story is that Multivac's questions have nothing to do with politics. Multivac asks Norman questions like, what do you think about the price of eggs? Or do you favor central incinerators? So he's bypassing political reasoning, or Multivac is leading Norman to bypass political reasoning. And I think this gets at, something really profound about American politics back then, and more so now, is that we see our politics as increasingly divorced from the forces of reason and increasingly driven by pressures that appear to not be interpretable as political reasons. So I thought that was really, it gave me chills to read that.
And I found myself fascinated by this question of why Norman was chosen, because again, it feels like there are two ways of reading it. He is, as I said at the beginning, he's just a typical guy. He's kind of boring. He's living a very average life. He is the average American. And so on that representative sample version of what you might do, predicting on the basis of a small data set to a much bigger outcome, you want representativeness as the basis of what you're doing. You want him to be as typical as possible of how other people are going to behave. But the possibility you've just raised, it doesn't really have anything to do with his averageness. It's to do with his, and then it's not clear what the word is here. Is it his malleability? Is it his impressionableness? Is it that he's not a partisan? Because, of course, he's got to be atypical in some ways, certainly now, and I suspect even then, but now in an age of partisan politics, most people's views are very fixed, actually. Most people know exactly how they're going to vote, and most people are deeply prejudiced against the other side. Is he meant to be representative of the person who is open-minded? Because he's also comes across as a pretty unimaginative guy. So is this suggesting that there is a correlation between being incurious and unimaginative and actually being open-minded? And this goes to a deep debate in political science about the relative open-mindedness of independents and partisans. And some of the people who call themselves independents, free thinkers, actually are less open-minded sometimes than some people who are in a way less curious about the world, but then when they come across a new fact are more responsive to it. It's not at all clear what makes Norman typical.
That's right. Or what makes him a good voter. So this normative question of what makes the good voter is really interesting here. And I think all those ambiguities are there. But there's another character in the story that's really interesting, and that's the father-in-law, right? Matthew. Matthew is old enough to remember when he was able to vote by actually walking up and casting his own vote. And of course, his granddaughter and his daughter are bemused by his nostalgia for the old voting practice. But he says it at one point, he's very angry about Multivac, Matthew is. Matthew thinks this is a sham. And at one point, he talks about the fact that, his granddaughter has asked, but how did people know who to vote for? Did Multivac tell them? And he looks at her, and furrows his brow and says, they use their own judgment, girl. And she just has no idea what the hell he's talking about, right? This is meaningless. But then, he says, look, I don't want a machine telling me how I would have voted just because some joker in Milwaukee says he's against higher tariffs. Maybe I want to vote cockeyed just for the pleasure of it. Maybe I don't want to vote, right? And so this idea that is the franchise about finding the perfect voter, a model of the perfect voter, and having that be what carries the day? And is that what Norman is? Is Norman, as you say, the most representative of the American political mind? And that's why his mind gives us the outcome. Or is the franchise ultimately more about every person having a say, whether or not their say is informed, whether or not their say is grounded in a kind of political consciousness? Because Matthew's saying, look, I should have the right to vote for reasons that have nothing to do with politics at all, just because I want to be a wrench in the works or something like that. And I think we've never in the history of democratic thought gotten to the bottom of that debate about whether the franchise is about you having the power and the voice, or whether it's about giving political reasons a space to matter.
Absolutely. I sometimes find myself thinking that the bit of democracy that people forget about is it's meant to be unpredictable. There is a core root definition of it in the ancient world, which is that democracy has built into it randomness. That's the point of it. All other forms of politics in their way are predictable, and predictable in the end correlates with corruptible. And the great thing about randomness is you don't know what's going to happen. So the randomness in classical Athenian democracy was people being chosen at random for the offices of state. But the idea was precisely that was not a predictable outcome. And that's what made democratic politics, in its weird way, alive, unpredictable, sort of almost organic. And all of the predictable models, the mechanistic predictable models, strip that out. I also thought it was really interesting that the father-in-law, he also says, as he gripes, and he sounds like an absolutely recognizable older male voter, as he gripes about how it didn't deliver on its promises, they said that it would be the end of partisanship. The point of this is that the voters' partisan preferences were pandered to by politicians, as happens now. You get your base and you pander to your base. But if you have your representative voter, your one person, whether malleable or predictable or standard, doesn't matter, that at least means that you won't get politicians spending the intervening period pandering to partisan feeling. And Matthew says, but they're still pandering. They're just trying to guess who's the voter going to be in the next election. So they're sort of scanning the country, trying to look for where they think the typical voter might be found, and then descending on that place and trying to influence that person with their partisan preferences. Plus, Assange, he says, you'll never strip it out. The other thing in that passage that you just read, you read it and it's he, and you might think, well, that's just the idiom of the time. But no, Asimov says, and you have to remember, this is imagining the world of 2008, it is taken for granted that every time the voter who's chosen will be a man, which actually, even in 1955, is a pretty extraordinary assumption, given the premises that we're talking about either representativeness or a version of human emotion of whatever kind that can be analyzed by the machine. Why? He never says, but why is it assumed the machine always needs to work on a man?
Well, and it's apparently not just an assumption, it's a rule that has now been baked into the process, right? Because they're debating what the odds are of Norman getting chosen at the beginning. And, it starts at 200 million. And they say, well, no, it's not 200 million, because, of course, it's only the men. And it's only the men between 20 and 60.
The grumpy father-in-law has been ruled out.
Yes, exactly. But particularly this exclusion of the franchise of women is completely unexplained. Now, Asimov's own personal history isn't exactly, and his own writing certainly isn't free of the flavor of misogyny and sexism. But it doesn't feel like it can just be that, because it's such a deliberate choice. I mean, women do have the vote in 1955 and have had it for decades. So it's not just kind of his background bias assumptions going in here. This is a deliberate framing of a future in which women no longer have the franchise and are no longer representative. And it's unclear whether that's because the assumption simply is that the woman's political mindset is always, in a sense, to be molded by the man's, right? Remember about this idea, but minds are molded by other minds. And of course, for much of the 20th century and even still today, many men in America expect their wives to ask them who they should vote for. And many men mark the ballot, the sample ballot, hand it to their wives and say, here you go, honey, go into the booth. So is that why it is only men who are selected? Because the assumption is that they're feeding the woman's vote in the first place? Or is it something else that Asimov's trying to say here about the future? I think it's quite a puzzling and unexplained choice.
Reading it now, one of the really distinctive features of this story is it's set in 2008, written in 1955. But it imagines 2008 as being like 1955 with multivac. It's like, Bloomington, Indiana is not some futuristic cityscape. It's not anywhere near as futuristic as the cityscape in Metropolis. It's just 1950s Bloomington, Indiana, including, I agree with you, the assumption that somehow yeah, women have been given the vote, but this is part of this crude phase of democracy where you've expanded the franchise to try and sort of accumulate as much information as possible to produce an outcome. But we're well beyond that. And one of the ways that we're beyond that is women clearly don't have as much of a stake in this as men. And Norman works, his wife is a housewife. It's a very conventional family, a wife, a daughter, the father living with them. But it's all about Norman's job. And I think it's that Victorian assumption from the 1950s extrapolated forward to 2008 that if you had a system where you were just to pick one voter, you clearly would have to pick a voter who was a head of household. And that the head of household, at the most basic level, already subsumes the interests of the household. And that it was just implausible in Asimov's mind that that would be a woman. But that does give the lie then to the thought that Norman can in any way be representative, because half the population can't be represented in that sense. Maybe in Asimov's mind, he thought his wife could be, but he's not speaking for all the women of America. The other thing that's really weird about this story is it made me look up the results of the 2008 election in Indiana, because so here he is imagining the most typical place he can think of. And again, typical is weird here because if it's a sort of anonymous kind of place, it's not particularly typical. Bloomington, Indiana is not typical of California or New York or the rural South, or it's just one version of America. In 2008, Indiana happens to have been a swing state. So the 2008 election was between Obama and John McCain. I should say Obama and Joe Biden, John McCain and Sarah Palin. It was that election. And Indiana was almost, I don't think it was quite the closest. I think maybe Missouri was the closest, but I think it was the second closest state. Obama won it by barely 1% of the vote. So it really was a swing state. So in a way, he's done kind of quite well, Asimov. He's chosen a state that in 2008 is one of the states where the vote really mattered, in the way that it doesn't matter in California or New York because you know which way it's going to go, or parts of the American South, solidly Republican, solidly Democrat. And then within Indiana, the county that contains Bloomington, which is Monroe County, was overwhelmingly for Obama. So actually it was very partisan, as I think those kinds of towns were. It was a rural versus more urban vote. And I just found myself thinking, but what's typical here? Like a swing state's not typical? Within the swing state, you might say, okay, here's Indiana. It was very close. So maybe an Indiana voter is a sort of symbol of the decision of the election, but not in Bloomington because they all voted for Obama. And it doesn't make sense past a certain point. There is no typical version of the voter because swing state voters are not typical. In the election this year, certain states count more than other states. But that's not what this is saying. It's not saying Norman counts more because Indiana is close. And the ones who count more are not typical Americans. They just happen to live in Michigan.
I now want to Google when Indiana University was founded, because one of the reasons, of course, that Bloomington voted so overwhelmingly for Obama is because of the demographics of being a college town in America. And I wonder if it was a college town in 1955. I'd have to look it up. But if the demographics in Bloomington were very different in 1955, it might have something to do with why Asimov picked it. But I want to go back to the first point that you made, which was about the conservatism in Asimov's vision of the future here. Now, as a choice, as a writer, and there's many possible reasons why he would have made that choice. It could reflect Asimov's own conservatism. It could reflect the view that progress entails, the consolidation of these particular social norms and structures. But one of the things that I thought was interesting, whether it was intended to be interesting or not, is this union of multivax power with the conservative future, with a future that has not changed much socially from 1955. And it made me think of, so I have a chapter in my new book, The AI Mirror, that talks about this very story, talks about it in the context of automation of algorithmic decision-making. But elsewhere in the book, I talk a lot about Joseph Weizenbaum, who is a computer scientist from the 1960s, who's famous for inventing the first well-known chatbot, Eliza, that was capable of enticing users to disclose personal and intimate thoughts, to treat it as if it were human, which horrified Weizenbaum to no end. And helped shape his later thinking about the problems of computing in society. So he writes this landmark book, which I try to get everybody to read, Computer Power and Human Reason, in 1976. And one of the points that I think is deeply underappreciated in that book, and that I try to amplify in my own work lately, is that one of the primary functions of the computing revolution, and after the computing revolution, the so-called digital media revolution, one of the primary functions of the computer revolution has been to conserve social, political, and economic structures that, on Weizenbaum's view, would have teetered and likely had to be reconstructed were it not for the power of computers to maintain the status quo. So he argues at the end of the book, he says, if the power of a revolution is to be measured by the extent of the social change and cultural change that it enables, then there has been no computer revolution. He's writing this in 1976, and he says, I don't think the computer has changed anything. In fact, I think the computer revolution has just given the people with power the ability to sustain an unsustainable socioeconomic and cultural order for a lot longer than they would have been able to do. And I think that is something that really broke me when I read that, because it's fundamentally so very true. And there are a lot of things that have changed. But the kind of value system that drives society today at its base, and the incentives that we use to structure society, really don't look that different from the post-industrial order of the 20th century. And so I read Franchise, and I read this, vision of the future that is powered by a supercomputer. And it's not just about the elections, right? Handley tells Norman Miller, elections aren't the only thing it's used for. The implication is there's all these super secret things that the government uses multivac to do that we don't even know about. So we have a future in which a supercomputer that can presumably do almost anything is available to the powers that be. And yet the future looks exactly the same as it does now. Whether that was intended by Asimov to be a commentary, I think we should take it as a warning.
And that does also give another possible answer to the question of why Norman is chosen, because I think a lot of people reading this story, certainly I had the thought of, what would I do if I was picked? And there's a temptation, I think the grandfather would have it, which is why he's excluded from the franchise, to be subversive, or to think this is an extraordinary amount of power, even if I don't get to pick the president. My God, my preferences are going to be the ones that decide the future of the country. But Norman is the single most subservient human being on the planet. He is. So first of all, he's terrified. He's desperate not to be picked because he thinks it's just going to be trouble and attention, and he's anxious. He's sweating. He's terrified when the process is happening. He wants to do it right. He keeps nervously asking the handler, what happens if I get the answer wrong? And the handler says, doesn't matter. And then at the end, he's in awe of the machine. He's come around to the thought that he's been through this sort of great privileged process in which he's been blessed as being chosen as this representative person. He is, small c, the most conservative person you can imagine. And you might think, well, that's obviously why Multivac chose him. There are lots of people who would give Multivac a hard time, but not Norman. Norman is the future because Norman is the past.
That's right. And there's this phrase that Asimov uses to describe him. He's a man with a clerkly soul. And he is literally a clerk. That's his job, right? But it's not just that he is a clerk as his mode of employment. He has a clerkly soul, which I think is Asimov's way of trying to tell you exactly this, that Norman Miller is deliberately or characteristically unexceptional and conservative in the sense that he's disinclined to think past the status quo. There's something else about the book that I think is interesting also that's related to a lot of work that goes on in the field of AI ethics that I work in. One of the problems that myself and other people are constantly coming back to is this question of responsibility and accountability for automated decisions and the actions, particularly harmful actions, of autonomous systems that are opaque and unpredictable. And so there's a phrase for this in the literature. It's called the responsibility gap challenge. And it's the idea that there are certain kinds of actions that powerful autonomous systems will take that have consequences of the sort that require someone to be morally responsible for for those consequences. And yet, because the action will have been so distanced from human decision making and even the ability to kind of anticipate and control what the machine does, that it will be unjustifiable to hold any human morally responsible for what the system has done. And yet the system itself, because we're not talking about AGI, we're not talking about machines that have thoughts and opinions and can be held accountable in their own way. Because it's still just a mindless machine, we certainly can't hold the machine morally responsible. So the idea is there's a gap here. And I thought it was really interesting towards the end of the story, or actually it's in the middle where it first comes up, where, as you say, Norman's super nervous and he just doesn't want the attention. He doesn't want the blame. If it turns out that the elections lead to, terrible leaders doing stupid things that harm the country. And his wife, Sarah, says, look, it's not your responsibility. It's Multivac's responsibility. Everybody knows that. If Multivac just picks you, you have no control. And this is all Multivac. It's not you. And Norman says, everyone is supposed to know that, but they don't. And he starts ranting about this prior election, the election of 1988, where the Ridgely administration was elected. And he says, when they talk about the Ridgely administration of 1988, do they say he won them over with pie-in-the-sky promises and racist baloney? No, they talk about the goddamn McCumber vote, as though Humphrey McCumber was the only man who had anything to do with it because he faced Multivac. And I thought it was this really interesting reflection on the fact that even when we hand over moral and political responsibility to machines, we're still wired to want some human to hang for it if it goes wrong. And we're dealing with this today, right? With this incredible challenge of trying to figure out how, if we do allow morally high-stakes decisions to be made by machines, which people like myself think in many cases we should not be doing. But if we do, or if in some cases, all things considered, it is the right thing to do, perhaps because it can save, so many human lives that all of the other problems with it just get drowned in the benefits, that in that case, still, there's going to need to be some kind of accountability or responsibility. And at the end of the day, we don't know how to make it anything other than human. And so how do we hold ourselves responsible for what's happening in particularly American politics today, which, broadly speaking, most people on both sides of the political spectrum see as corrupted, degraded. No one thinks the American political system is healthy at the moment. I'm old enough to know that no one ever has. Like, everyone has always thought that American politics is crap and a mess and idiotic, but never more so than right now. It has been on a steep decline of late. And yet, who's responsible for that? Is it the person who's selling people with racist baloney, making up stories about Haitian immigrants eating cats in middle America in Ohio, very close to Indiana? Is that person the cause? Or is it this kind of collective that somehow knows that this is all going wrong and yet cannot seem to make it right? And the reason I think this is really interesting is because I think we are in a moment, and have been for some time, where we have a declining confidence in human judgment. And so when we go back to this idea of Matthew saying, we used to use our own judgment. Well, why don't we still use our judgment? It's not just that Multivac's cheaper. It's not just that Multivac produces an outcome that maybe is less vulnerable to hacking and corruption than, manual voting, where, votes can be perhaps stolen or forged or something like that. None of those justifications are provided for Multivac here. It seems as if one of the implications is that we choose Multivac because we don't trust humans to make these decisions for themselves anymore. And I think we're in that place where it's very hard to resist those of us who, in the field of AI ethics, who try to challenge the default assumption that automated decision-making is the future. One of the reasons that's so hard to fight against is because so many people think, look, what more proof do we need than the present in American politics and sort of, global decision-making more broadly? What more proof do we need that humans can't be trusted with the franchise anymore?
To that point, one of the most striking features of American politics is that the institution in which the people express the least confidence, and that's saying something, is the House of Representatives. And It's called the House of Representatives because it's the one that most closely represents them. So if it is dysfunctional, I mean, some of this is gerrymandering, right? But even the gerrymandering is a reflection of voter preferences at some level because they tolerate it. But also the divisiveness in the House of Representatives is a representation of the country more than the presidency, which, after all, at any given moment speaks for everybody, but has only been elected by, at best, half, and actually nowhere near half if you factor in all the non-voters. But the House of Representatives, the one that people really hate, is the one that reflects them. I also found myself thinking, I love Mrs. Muller's response to that exchange that you described. So when Norman is having a meltdown because he realizes it's going to be the Mueller election, and that's quite a big deal, right? You can imagine. I mean, that would freak the best of us out. I think I would be a little nervous about having my name appended to the election. But she says, but Norman, it could mean a promotion. Think of what it will do for you at work. She's got a Clarkley soul too, or she's got a kind of Mrs. Clarkley soul. It's the most 1950s vision. And again, some people would try and leverage this into something worthwhile. And Mrs. Mueller says, we could do with a bit more money, and people will just inevitably, even though it's completely nothing to do with you that you got chosen, but we will benefit from it. And so the typical voter then becomes atypical because it becomes the Mueller election. But my God, it's a 1950s vision of what you might do with that power.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a story that doesn't reflect confidence in the future of human judgment. I mean, it's a pretty dark tale.
Do you think it's a parody? I really couldn't tell.
I can't tell either, to be honest.
Is that last line ironic?
Yes, it is. Yeah, this last line about the untrammeled franchise. I mean, I think you're supposed to identify with Matthew. I mean, Norman and Sarah, the clerkly ones, are described in such a way that it's almost impossible not to feel some sort of disdain for the fact that these are the people who are going to choose the future in some way, or that, this mindset is the one that's going to define the future for the next election cycle. And I think it reflects, as many elites in society have always had, this ambiguity about democracy, right? We like the idea of it, but the fact of the matter is a lot of people still think that at some level, the aristocrats, not the current meaning of aristocrat, but the older meaning of aristocrat, the people with the best political minds. A lot of people still believe that the people with the best political minds ought to be determining the outcomes. And so there's this long battle in American politics between, coming back to the earlier point, those who just want to expand the franchise as widely as possible, and those who want to elevate the political mindset within those that hold the franchise. And you can do both of those things at once. And much of post-war America for a while was doing pretty well at pushing things in that direction, right? Expanding public education, making it more accessible and affordable to first-generation students like myself, and making things like the Voting Rights Act a powerful way of expanding the franchise to Black Americans and many others who had been denied by various other means, political access. So, you had this post-war period starting about 10 years after this was written, where we actually do double down on both expanding the political franchise more equitably, but also increasing the accessibility and power of political reasoning and trying to make this something that isn't just for the elite. And it's really crushing, actually, that we've moved so far away from that in the last few decades, since about 1980, 1990, really since the rise of a certain reactionary anti-intellectual trend again in the United States. We've defunded public education. The Supreme Court has declined to support the continued protections of the Voting Rights Act in a meaningful way. And we see, again, I think, this reactionary move to dispense with the things that make democracy work. So I read this story as a parody, but I also read it as a warning of exactly what has happened.
And one of the features of contemporary democracy is that if you are trying to predict the outcomes of elections, one of the most useful data sets is level of educational attainment for trying to work out how people are going to vote. It's true in Britain, it's true across Europe, it's true in all of the developed democracies. It's true in all the countries where higher education has been massively expanded. So you get, in many societies, a kind of 50-50 divide between the college-educated classes and the non-college educated classes. And that division is writ large in our politics. It's nowhere in this story because Norman's definitely not a college guy, I'm pretty sure. But it's as though those kinds of divisions don't exist. And I want to say one more thing about Bloomington, because as you were speaking, it reminded me of something that I remembered, which is one of my favorite films, which is called Breaking Away. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's set in Bloomington, Indiana. So that's the 1970s, the late 70s. And it's about a group of kids young men who happen to be obsessed with European cycling. That's not the issue here. But it's also about the class divide in the town. And the class divide is exemplified by the fact that some of their dads, stonemasons who built the university, and some of these kids are the products of that university. And that is already the divide. And this is only 20 years on from franchise, but we're already in a different world. Bloomington is already a different world by the late 70s. If people read this story, I'd also recommend watching Breaking Away, because you won't recognize the town, right? And it's a beautiful film, but it's 20 years on. I want to ask one last question, which is to go back to where we started. I suggested at the beginning there are these two things going on in this story. There is the question about the capacity of this machine to predict how human beings will behave, and then the capacity of this machine to interpret people's preferences better than they know them themselves. Now, on the first, it's not clear we've made massive progress. We can argue about that. I suspect you and I wouldn't argue about that. But on the second, this is part of the hype of Silicon Valley. This is a big part of what we are meant to believe is happening in a transformative way around us, that technologies now are able to read our behavior in such a way that allows them to know things about us that we don't know about ourselves. And sometimes what's given as an example of maybe the absurd place this might end up is that our laptops will tell us how we should vote, because they will look at our search history and they will say to us, you think you're a Labour voter, but actually, given the websites that you tend to hang out on, you're more of a Liberal Democrat. And this is built into many of the models that we use every day, that they treat us as creatures capable of being interpreted in that way so we can be fed the things that they think that we want. Is that the area where progress has been made, or should we be as skeptical of that as we are of the idea that give a computer the first 10 votes in a general election and they'll tell you the next 100 million?
Well, I think actually the point that I want to make about this is that even if the machines get it right about who I have been, what the machines are saying is that all you are and all you will be and should be is who you have already been. Algorithmic systems, and particularly large language models built on large volumes of our data, are really mirrors of our past that actually project those patterns from those images into the future to make the future resemble the past. They're mirrors that essentially have this conservative function. And one of the things that's, to me, really, as a humanist and a philosopher, really terrifying about AI systems today is their power to take the future away from us simply by ensuring that the function of human aspiration becomes mooted. So by aspiration, I mean something like the way that philosophers have talked about the fact that you have your basic desires, your first order desires, and then you have second order desires. Second order desires are desires about what you want to desire. So it might be the case that I don't actually day to day desire to be more compassionate, or I don't desire to act compassionately. But I might, at the same time, desire to be the sort of person who is compassionate. I might have a moral ambition to be more compassionate than I am. I might have a moral ambition to be more patient than I am. I might form and do form new ambitions all the time about what kind of person I would like to become. And then I can take on the sort of work that might help me become more like that sort of person. And we can do the same thing socially, right? And have done the same thing socially, where we say, look, we are not a just society, or we are not a fair society. We are a racist society. We are a society that's, deeply embedded in class and gender and race inequities that we haven't gotten away from. But we want to get away from those things, and we will build social structures that will help push us away from those things. that kind of political thinking requires an understanding not just of what we've been and are at this very moment, but what we want to become. And something like an algorithmic tool of prediction that predicts based on where I am right now and that alone is in fact incapable of helping me form a new thought or walk a new path or help society identify a new path that it might walk. And that's, to me, incredibly terrifying, not just in terms of the capacity to shut down people's awareness of their own potential and awareness of their capacity to change, but more importantly, from a socioeconomic standpoint and an environmental standpoint, we are on, collectively, as a human family, an entirely unsustainable path. And we know it. We know we cannot keep the status quo. We will burn up the planet and all the resources that we need, and frankly, that all intelligent life on this planet needs in order to flourish. We have to change path. We have to change course. And yet we're building systems that are designed specifically to keep us on course by predicting the course that we've already taken and pushing that out into the future. So I think this is a warning not only of the capacity of machines perhaps to be opaque and untrustworthy and unclear if they're really acting as we would, but even if they are acting as we have and most likely would, something like multivac in this political context strips away the responsibility to become something else. And I think that's another powerful warning that Asimov has given us.
And it goes back to that point about democracy on one definition being surprising. And you could say, well, if my computer says to me, you think you're a Labour voter, but you're not, that's surprising. But that's not the surprising that you want. You want the surprising where you say to the computer, no, I'm going to surprise you, where the voter says to the system. And after all, democracy is itself just a vast algorithm. That's all it is. It's a way of coming up with an answer depending on the system that you use to input the data. But when it works, it's surprising. You just don't know. And yeah, I took from this story that there is a future in which you do know there's nothing actually surprising about Norman. And that's not democracy.
Absolutely. And I think, as they say, what democracy is the worst of all possible political systems, except for all the other ones we've tried. And so these contradictions at the heart of democracy will never go away. But I think what this story foresees in a way that's quite chilling is the power of algorithmic systems to convince us that we don't need that we don't need that surprise. And that in the language of Silicon Valley, surprise is just, surprise is a rounding error. Surprise is an inefficiency. Surprise is friction. Surprise is noise. And what you want is a system that will strip all that out. You want a system that will strip out the noise and get you just the pure signal. You want a system that will strip out the inefficiency and friction and give you just the most direct route, the most optimized path. And that's precisely the opposite of what democracy is for.
A reminder that if you would like to hear the bonus episode that I've recorded to accompany this series about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, it's available now on PPF Plus, and to subscribe, you just click on the link in the show description or go to ppfideas.com. It's very straightforward. We also have a new newsletter, our free fortnightly newsletter, coming out tomorrow. Again, you can sign up for that using the link in the show description. That's going to accompany the last two of our What If episodes about the fall of the Berlin Wall and Scottish independence, but also the first two in this series. And it will include, if you're interested, clips from Metropolis, including Maria's, or I should say, Robot Maria's, really weird dance. Next time, I'm talking to Shannon about a book that is the basis of another great film, Blade Runner, but we're not going to be talking about the film. We're talking about the underlying story. Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.